Sociology at Rice University, where she's also a Rice Scholar at the Baker Institute for Public Policy, focusing on science and technology policy. In fact, you can read the rather long biography, and she is, with all her research, she's very interested in public outreach and publishing in a lot of more widely circulated journals and so on. And she's very interested in the role of science in society, and particularly on the way scientists think about religion. And there's a recent study she's done on that in the US. So I think I'll just leave it at that and say over to you, Elaine.
I think that often for those of you who are social scientists, I'm a professor of sociology, that sometimes research ideas come to us through personal experiences, different from natural scientists in some way. Social scientists are very much inhabitants of the research lab that we have. We are people too, right? So I remember the distinct moment when I thought, oh, I should do a research study on what scientists think about religion. I was actually completing my PhD work at Cornell University in the States, and I was doing a study looking at religion and family life, and going to congregations and studying what kinds of programs related to family life and what versions of family different kinds of congregations have. And I remember a woman saying to me, you know, I want to make sure, after I explained I was a PhD student at Cornell, she said, I would never want my child to go to Cornell University. And I don't know how much you know about the university landscape, but Cornell is an Ivy League school. It's thought of to be quite good in some circles. And I said, well, that's interesting. You know, why wouldn't you, is it too expensive? You know, why wouldn't you want your child to go to Cornell University? So, well, probably the scientists there would take her away from her faith. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. Is that really true? You know, are scientists out to, now I'm going to use an American colloquialism, are they out there to eat Christian students for lunch? You know, are they these big, mean, ugly, bad people that are sort of systematically against all forms of faith? And I looked around, there hadn't really been any systematic research on that topic, and I thought, oh, I have a research idea. And then for the past 8 years, actually, I've been studying this topic among the other things that I study. In some ways, religion and science and their connection has become a global concern, not just a local one in the U.S. In the U.S., there's extensive controversy over stem cell research, religious groups in opposition to it. There's, of course, controversy about teaching evolution in public schools and whether different versions of the development of life on Earth should be taught, particularly religiously informed versions, as some would argue. In the EU, there's a newfound worry about traditional forms of religion, what some call fundamentalist forms of religion, and what kind of impact immigrant religion in particular will have on science education. In a place like Turkey, there's a concern that what some see as an Islamic influence on the recent government will cripple a developing science infrastructure and have a negative impact on it. In China, there's charges in another kind of way that ethical breaches by Chinese scientists may result actually from a kind of pervasive secularity. So a charge that there's perhaps not enough religion among Chinese scientists. To that, I bring research questions that I think have a kind of international focus. So a question such as, how do the religious identities of scientists influence their entrance into science? In some circles, does a religious identity actually hamper or hinder someone from pursuing science, or does maybe in others it facilitate that? How do the religious beliefs of scientists influence their application of science in different spheres of public life? This is in some ways bridging with Jonathan Wu's recent talk right before mine. Does religious faith sometimes give scientists motivation to do particular kinds of outreach, to share their work with particular communities and constituencies in specific ways? And how do scientists perceive religion and state relationships to have an influence on science? Is there fear of a religious populace among some scientific communities, or are there ways of bridging these two communities, of course recognizing that some scientists are themselves religious and part of particular religious and faith communities? And what challenges do these religious scientists face? Do they face forms of discrimination, or is that overblown? Is there a kind of connection that they find to connect their work, their scientific work, to their religious faith? In the past 5 years, I have been very concerned with the U.S. scientific community. And part of my concern is based on a line of scholarship within the social scientists that started over 100 years ago, or nearly 100 years ago. The psychologist James Luba was very concerned in the early 20th century with the question of whether or not elite scientists were necessarily irreligious. He made some assertions that as scientists became more elite, that they would necessarily let go of religion, and use that to infer that therefore religion and science must be in some kind of intractable conflict, because of course the scientists that are the most elite would be the ones that would know the most about science. I think that thinking is a little bit philosophically flawed. But others have then followed up on that. Many of you know the work of the very important historian Ed Larson, and Larry Whittam, a journalist, did a study that's gotten a lot of publicity. It's been published in Nature, and then they published also elsewhere, essentially replicating the work that James Luba did in the early 20th century among the same population of people. Also in the UK, there's been work, early work as well, where the British Royal Society Fellows were questioned on their religious belief and found to not be as traditionally religious as the general public at the time, but to have some sort of sense of spirituality. I think that there is some limitation of that scholarship. It's primarily US-based and to some extent UK-based. Few studies examine the religious beliefs, identities, and practices of science globally. In general, U.S. social science has been very impoverished in terms of comparing findings in the U.S. to other nations. I think that makes for a kind of problematic view of what is generalizable. The data, of course, is quite old. And it's somewhat abstract. The whole conversation about religion and science in general is somewhat abstract. There's little understanding of how religion and science connect for scientists themselves, except these few very old studies that I just mentioned. There also are generally pretty poor measures of religion and somewhat poor social science methods. So studies use, maybe 3 or 4 questions about religion rather than complex measures of religion, mixed methods of data collection, those kinds of things. I'm just embarking on a research study right now. I'm actually at the very beginning of it. It just started a couple of months ago. It's called the Religion Among Scientists in International Context Study. And I'm working on this research with 2 colleagues at Rice University, a science policy expert, Kirsten Matthews, as well as a sinologist, since one of the cases that we're studying is China, Stephen Lewis. And in this study, we will look at 7 different nations, the US, the UK, Turkey, Italy, France, China, and India, and examine junior and senior scientists, biologists and physicists in those nations. And we're very interested in examining scientists who are at the very early stages of their career, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, all the way through those who are at the most advanced stages of their career, to understand to some extent, if we do redo panels of this data, how views change over time on these issues, but also compare junior scientists to more senior scientists. We are studying biology and physics, 2 very different science disciplines that have faced different religious challenges. Physics, the religious challenges of physics were some time ago, although there's this newfound with the recent, all the publicity about the Higgs boson. My husband's a particle physicist, so I've been at CERN these past weeks, and it's been quite something. And then I've recently come here and am now interviewing some scientists in the Cambridge and Oxford area and in London as well. And scientists, of course, think this connection of the Higgs boson to any kind of theistic implications is vastly overblown and just inaccurate. But it does bring a kind of space to once again discuss religious issues in the physics community, which is interesting to me. And biology, of course, faces many present, what they perceive as present challenges from religious communities. We will follow up this survey, which will take the next 3 years, with in-depth interviews of between 600 and 700 scientists. So we'll take a sample of those who respond to the survey and then either do in-person, most of them will be done in-person interviews, and some of them over Skype or phone with those who we cannot reach in person. So it's a mixed methods data collection, extremely time intensive to collect this kind of data, but I hope will have important implications. I want to tell you just a little bit about, somehow that always makes people laugh. I'm not exactly sure why it's the crazy hair. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of the work that I've done previously on how scientists in the U.S. view religion. And some of this is prefaced with the kind of interesting tension which has been raised in some of the other talks that Americans have with science. So there's this kind of love-hate relationship. So on one hand, there's someone like Albert Einstein, who's this almost become this larger-than-life figure that still among students. Some have pictures of Einstein on their dorm room walls, and I did for some reason. I had sort of early love for science. And then there's this other kind of figure. You have the scientist of science fiction. There are all these movies of, the scientist is going to kind of put us under. They have some discovery that's going to blow up the world, and they're somehow dangerous or difficult, not able to communicate with the public, reclusive, and we should be very, very suspicious of the scientific community. So there are those dual images that are going on in the American public that in some ways frames this whole dialogue or lack of dialogue about the intersection of science and religion. On one hand, the U.S. public places incredible authority in science. 90%, according to a recent National Science Foundation Science Indicators survey to look at the U.S. public and the way in which they view science, 90% express interest in new scientific discoveries. Most communities want their children immunized, although that is debated in some. Who doesn't want a cure for cancer? And sometimes even the phrase, and if you think about this, I think you'll realize that I'm right about this, even the phrase studies show is enough to gain a hearing, not among some of my natural science colleague friends who of course want to know which studies and the citations for them and things like that, but the general public, even just saying that brings a kind of legitimacy. You see these commercials for toothpaste, 4 out of 10 dentists say that this will make you prettier and have cavities go away, right? Who are these dentists? And 50%, on the other hand, according to a recent survey, say that we depend too much on science and not enough on faith. There's the kind of tension there. There are all kinds of statistics about what proportion of Americans want creation taught in public schools and what exactly that means, but one conservative estimate is that 40% do. And 25% think that scientists are hostile to religion, according to a recent survey that that colleagues of mine at Baylor University did. In some ways, the perceptions that U.S. Religious people have of scientists seem founded. Of course, the work of Richard Dawkins has been exported by you to us. And in a recent journalistic interview that he did, he said that religious beliefs are irrational. Religious beliefs are dumb, and dumb or super dumb. Religion drives otherwise sensible people into celibate monasteries or crashing into New York skyscrapers. That sort of emphasis, dumb, dumb, or super dumb. As I said, to mention again, that nearly 25% of the American public thinks that scientists are hostile to religion. Now, I do think we need much better data on what the public thinks about scientists and science. And Jennifer Weissman and I are just embarking on a project to collect some of that data, which I'm very, very excited about. But even the little bit of data that we do have shows that the American public has a kind of fraught relationship with science, and that part of it is based on their perception of how science intersects with faith. So from 2005 to 2008, I did a survey with leading U.S. university scientists, so places like Harvard, University of Michigan, large research universities, Stanford University was another in my population. I had a very wide view of science. In this new international research, I'm narrowing that view of science some, but in this other study that I did, I surveyed 7 different disciplines, looking from physics to psychology. So for those of you who are social scientists in the room, you can ask me to parse that a little bit more. I wanted to use very diverse religious indicators, so I wanted to understand what scientists think not only about traditional indices of measuring religion, such as, do you read the Bible if you're from a Christian tradition? Do you attend a religious organization? But I also wanted to understand things like more fuzzier conceptions of spirituality, how they think about the definitions of religion, of spirituality, the extent to which religion has or does not have any impact on the scientific work they do. I wanted a very broad notion of religion, as well as to replicate earlier studies that have been done and earlier measures of religion in the general population, as well as the scientific community. And I wanted to examine both religious and non-religious scientists. There's quite a bit of literature and discussion where highly, almost perhaps is overstating it, anti-religious scientists are writing works on their thoughts, and very religious scientists are writing works on their thoughts. You have this almost sort of 2 polar sets of writings that are many of them sort of autobiographical. But I wanted to have everything, both of those, but everything in between. So that's where I think that having an actual random sample of scientists in this population is extremely useful to find out the sort of range of ways that people see these things in the university population that I studied in this case. I wrote a book on this topic called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think. And in it I talk about a survey that I did of 2,200 scientists. We had a response of 75%, which is very high for modern day survey research. And then I followed that up with 275 in-depth interviews where I took another random sample, or scientifically selected sample is another way to think about it, of those who responded to the survey, and actually went to their offices, to their labs and their laboratories, and followed them around with my tape recorder and asked them what they think about these topics. And I think it's very important to couple these 2 kinds of research methodologies. In survey research, for those of you who have filled out a survey, you know that the researcher decides the categories from which you can choose, right? So I have a question and I say, what's something like, what's your religious identity? And I decide for you, and usually it's based on good kinds of reasons, right? These are religious identity categories that we found among the public, etc. And I decide for you the range. I decide that you can choose Catholic, you can choose Jewish. I decide whether or not you have to choose one category exclusively, or whether you can choose more than one. And I think that's very important, especially for doing research on very large populations. It gives you a sense of reliability across cases. It's very hard, though, to understand how people think outside of the box, literally, using that kind of methodology. So I wanted to couple that with another kind of methodology where I did what we call life history interviews, where I asked scientists about the whole range of ways that religion was important or not important throughout the entire course of their lives. Questions about religious shifts in their life, questions about how they connect or do not connect religion and ethics, whether or not they have religious colleagues and what they think of those colleagues and how they know that they're religious, to get a sense of the extent to which religion is openly discussed in particular departments and university contexts. So those 2 kinds of methods, I think, help you get at the range of both reliability but also the depth of validity to understand, are you really studying what you think you're studying? Do you really have the right kind of indicators of your phenomenon? I think what I found in that study, and and I'll talk with you in a moment about the international research that we're doing and what we're finding in our very initial pilot study. But I think what I found among US scientists is really how you interpret the findings depends on whether your perspective is the glass half empty or half full. And I have given probably nearly 60 talks on my book and on this particular research, and I have received a wide range of responses. And so I'll present, what I see as sort of the contours of this particular data set, and then how it relates to what we're finding in this international project, and then we can have a discussion, about what you think that the implications might be for the questions that are of interest to you. I found in a very basic overview, and know that there are much more complicated statistical models behind these things, that if you want to write me and ask for papers that I've written for different journals, I'm very happy to share those with you. But in brief, about 30% of scientists in the US social and natural science community, the elite research universities, see themselves as secularists. And that's a term that one of my respondents used. He said something like, I'm an avowed secularist. And those are persons that see themselves as having an atheist identity, that they are very committed to not being religious. So people, when you ask them on a survey, have you been to a congregation of any type in the past year, even for a wedding or funeral, would say no, not even for a wedding or funeral. So have a real commitment to not interfacing with religious organizations at all, even in the most cursory way. About 50% of this very select population sees themselves as religious to a certain extent. There's been widespread media misreporting of this research. One article that I read about my research said that I had mentioned that 50% of US scientists are evangelical Christians, which that is not the case. So that's, you have a very particular perspective. So that is not the case, and I'll share with you in a moment that their religious identities are very different than those of the US public, but they do have some kind of attachment, some kind of affiliation with religion. They see themselves, they classify by a particular religious tradition. They have some interface, some sort of attendance in religious organizations of various sorts. And about 20% see themselves as spiritual, and I will parse in a moment more about what that means in particular. They see themselves as not religious, very specifically, but they want a higher order sense of meaning that cannot be found, that is both consistent with science, but yet outside of science. And I've written an article on that topic called Science and Spirituality, and I argue in that article that this kind of spirituality among this very specific scientific population, elite US research universities, is very different than the spirituality of the general US public. And I've gotten some criticism, but I stand by that. So let's talk a little bit more about what it means to be secular in this community. And the reasons, when I interviewed scientists, we ended up with about 5,000 pages of transcribed materials, and then I had at one point 10 different students, research assistants, working with me, go through these materials and code them for consistent themes. And three major themes arose for the reasons that scientists give for being secular. One is that science simply trumps religion. So, and I want to, it was very surprising to me that this was actually a minor theme. So I'm going from minor to major here. And I thought it would actually be a major theme when I started this project. I'll give you a quote from a physicist, and these are all pseudonyms because I don't use their real names in the confidential study, who said that as a child I was infected by religion, but now I'm immune. He thinks this view is shared by other scientists who are all just astonished at this sort of viral nature of faith-based thinking, which only exists because parents infect their children, and then there's a new generation, and they go on to infect more. So he's very troubled by the social reproduction of religion. He believes very strongly that all scientists agree with him. So, I just like the sort of viral metaphor there because I like science too. So another reason, the last two reasons were actually more prevalent. One is the idea that religion has let them down. Now, People give overlapping reasons, so I'm choosing the one that they thought of as dominant when I asked them, could you point to the reason that's most dominant in your life? So this kind of reasoning, this group of scientists said that it's not so much that they learned more about science. I actually just talked to a scientist today who said this. It's not so much they learned more about science and then they decided not to be religious. They decided not to be religious very early on in their lives. And if you think about those maybe yourselves or others who are scientists, these are persons who are often very, very inquisitive at a very young age. Or a scientist that a research associate and I interviewed today, said that he decided, to not be religious at age 8, he put it. So that's a very young age to make a commitment to not be religious. And some of that was tied very strongly to the kind of experience that they had in the religious communities of their youth. So a brief quote from a woman who's a biologist whom I call Evelyn in my book, who said, when I asked hard questions, I was told just to make a decision to believe. My experiences with religion was that it was a way that judgment was passed on people who are different. And I talked to her for about 2 hours, and she went on to say that part of the reason that those in her, she was in particular was part of an evangelical Christian community, that people thought she was different because she asked so many questions, she was critically inquisitive, and she didn't find a place in her religious community that she could ask difficult questions and be taken seriously. She was told just to believe and not ask hard questions of her faith. For another group of scientists, a dominant reason they gave was that religion was simply foreign. There's a higher proportion of people in this particular population who are what I would call second-generation atheists. I think this is much more common in the UK than it is in the US. But in the US, it's still, even to this day, quite uncommon to be raised in a home where there was absolutely no religious presence, where your parents made a commitment to not raising you religiously. I think it perhaps will become more common, but right now that's still fairly an uncommon demographic. But 13% of scientists in this particular population were raised without any religious tradition at all. And beyond that, and that's at 2.5 times more than in the general U.S. population when I compare it to the General Social Survey, which is a general U.S. population survey that's done every 2 years. Beyond that, scientists were also 3 times more likely to be raised in homes where religion was not important, where they felt that religion wasn't really an integral part of what they did. They did not attend services weekly. They attended them only sporadically. Let's talk a little bit about the scientists in the U.S. who had some kind of religious identity. So they're definitely not evangelical Protestants. So in this population, about 2% self-identify by the label evangelical, compared to about 28% of the U.S. population, and that varies widely depending on how you conceptualize the term evangelical. I'm using just self-identity for the sake of this particular slide, but I conceptualize it elsewhere. What's salient here, to say a little bit more than is on this slide, is that when I take out the identity term, so when I say, what kind of congregation do you attend, what kind of beliefs do you have, actually the proportion of scientists in this community who are evangelical actually doubles, and that's statistically significant. Now, for those out there who want to see more evangelicals in the scientific community, it's still nothing to write home about. It's more like 4 or 5% rather than 2% at top U.S. research universities. But in my interview data following up, there does appear to be quite a bit of reticence among scientists who self-describe as evangelical because of the connotations that label has in the broader U.S. landscape as being anti-intellectuals. That theme came up quite prevalently in these interviews with this small group of people who had evangelical beliefs, namely those about the Bible, the sufficiency of the resurrection of Christ, those kinds of beliefs that sociologists of religion would classify as being evangelical Christian beliefs. There were no scientists in this population who self-described as being part of a black Protestant tradition. which in part is because of the very low proportion of African Americans at elite research universities in the U.S. to begin with, but also those who are there tend not to be from religious communities. You see that the Jewish category is the only one where there's the flip, where there were many more at U.S. research universities than in the general U.S. population. And I even took out the Jews from the survey who identified as only being ethnically Jewish rather than religiously Jewish. So there would be even more if I included everyone who had any identity as being Jewish. And there's a large proportion, about 51%, who say that they have no religious identity. I was very interested to do further research in about the 12% of scientists who were very committed evangelical Christians, evangelical Protestants, or Catholics. We said that those, because those two traditions are ones in the U.S. which recently have been behind some kind of what at least is perceived by the media and some in the scientific community is some kind of opposition to science. So I wondered how those who were what they called committed Christians lived these things out both in their scientific community, if this came up as being a point of discussion, if is influencing their work, as well as how they lived out being scientists in their religious community. So I wanted to understand both of those kinds of ways of living out faith. Oh, one backwards. They uniformly told me that they were more questioning. This didn't come as a surprise, but it sort of came out in funny ways. Like Tobin, a person I call Tobin, is a chemist who's Catholic, said, "I think some of my fellow Roman Catholics might accept many things at face value, such as finding religious imagery in natural phenomena. Being a scientist makes me want to raise objections like, well, does this grilled cheese sandwich really look like Jesus?" And I did Google Jesus and grilled cheese sandwich, which you can do like a lot of fun things with Google if you have a lot of time on your hands, as you know. I think this does not exactly look like Jesus, but there's something like 2,000 images on the web, so you can try to find a good one for yourself. And I don't mean that disrespectfully in any way to put that image up to Catholicism, but more to make the larger point that scientists see themselves as questioning in whatever context they're in. So they see themselves as more questioning of their faith. They see themselves as constantly questioning in the scientific community to really test data, and they take that into a religious community context. In religious, scientists in religious communities said to me that they practice what I've come to call a kind of secret science. So it went like this. They may have said that they were a scientist, that there's one poignant example of a scientist telling me that he thought perhaps it was one of the only ones in his congregation who was very committed to evolutionary theory, who's a biologist. And he said, I had a conversation once about this topic with someone else in the congregation, and it didn't really go so well. I said, well, then what did you do? He said, well, now I just sort of don't mention it anymore. I don't think he lies and says, well, no, I'm really a plumber when people ask, what is his profession? But he doesn't willingly bring it up, right, unless he's directly asked, because it tends to cause a little bit of controversy. I think that has an unintended consequence, which is that then people in congregations, both Catholic and Protestant and evangelical Protestant in this case, might have scientists, active scientists. I think there would be even more if we went outside this elite research community, might have active scientists in their congregations, perhaps people that they could talk to about their questions about science and faith. But these persons are are not very vocal. The scientists themselves are not very vocal about being a scientist, about their own ways of working out these connections, that the parishioners don't know these persons exist, that they've thought these things out, and this has, we lose the possibility of having mentors on this issue in congregational contexts. On the other side of things, there are also religious people in science, and I wondered how religious scientists interact in the scientific community. There were not very active Muslims in this community, but in particular I was interested in the Catholics and the evangelical Protestants. They made a huge point of telling me that they practice the same science as their colleagues. So 94% said that they were evolutionists, for example. And it was, as social scientists, we always examine very carefully when people bring up something when we didn't ask the question. So I assumed going into this study that a scientist who is a religious person who ends up teaching at a place like a Harvard University in the US probably is a good scientist. And I would assume that they would practice the same type of science as their colleagues, whether religious or not religious, so they would not be accepted by that guild. But they wanted me to know that they did not practice a different science, even though I didn't ask. It was one of the first things that they said, the religious scientists. And so as I reflected on that over and over, I think one of the reasons, and I even asked one of the respondents about this, with whom I had established quite good rapport, why are you telling me this? I would assume that you practice the same science. And he said, well, I'm asked that all the time, by both those in the scientific community and in my religious community. So obviously, it is a topic of conversation. Can you be a religious person, a very committed religious person, and a scientist? 94% of them were evolutionists, for example, which is about the same proportion. That survey question had about a 5 to 6% non-response, which is actually very good. They also practice what they would call a kind of secret faith or closeted faith in their religious communities, in their scientific communities, just as they practice a kind of secret science in their faith communities. 49% did not think their colleagues are positive about religion, and when I surveyed them, 30% would not answer the question. That, on the other hand, is quite a high non-response to a survey question. And I followed that up then in the interviews that I did with scientists and found that one of the reasons when I asked them, I sort of shared with them that there's this high non-response on the survey and why do you think people are unwilling to answer this question? And an answer that I often got was that they were very concerned about how the data would be used. They didn't want to say that their colleagues were against religion. So there was a lot of concern in this study about even publicly discussing this topic at all. And Janice, a physicist, who's at a very prestigious university, said, I think universities are not always very accepting environments. It's really hard to be a religious academic because the public opinion is such that you're either religious or you're a scientist. To say you are religious might mean other scientists would question your work. And so I asked her, so what happened? When you were religious, did you feel as if you got sanctions against your work, that your work was less likely to get published? And she said, well, I wouldn't know because I never actually talk about it. But for her, see, there's such a strong perception that if she would talk about it, that she would receive sanctions, that she just never discusses it at all. There is a small group of religious people, usually those who are in very prestigious places in their careers, who are very open about their particular faith, and they are actually commented on very positively by their colleagues. Jim, a sociologist who was in the study, social scientist, who himself was not religious, said that there are some people with very deep religious beliefs who simply don't let those things conflict. One of the lovely examples is Francis Collins. He's a very serious born-again Christian, obviously a firm believer, and manages to live very well with that. So there's a lot of tension around this issue in the scientific community. This very sociologist said elsewhere in my interview with him that in general he thought evangelical Christians were generally stupid, that it would be very difficult to be a scientist and be an evangelical Christian. But Collins was not in the study, as you should know. But his perception of someone like Collins is very, very positive. So when they see models, even when the scientists who see themselves as secular see models of people who are like Collins, who are both very committed religious people and scientists, they actually have a kind of respect for that, which was something that I found quite ironic and fascinating as a researcher myself, given the kind of tensions they had in their interview data, that they would actually mention evangelicalism very negatively in other contexts when I interviewed them. I think it's important too, though, to remember that these persons are usually only quite outspoken when they're quite advanced in their careers, when they feel protected. And so there's perhaps, the perception among younger scientists is not something you would want to do, that the sanctions would be too great, those kinds of things. About 20% of this community sees themselves as spiritual but not religious. And I argue in other work, and I will a little bit here, that there's a kind of different spirituality in the scientific community than in the general public. They see themselves as holding science and faith together. They want there to be a kind of consistency in their spirituality. There, for example, is the possibility of being a spiritual atheist, someone who does not believe in God or God, but still thinks that there's some sort of larger meaning that's outside myself, and most importantly, gives them some reason to be engaged. When I did statistical analyses in this spiritual population that had these particular views about spirituality, I did found that according to their own reports, they spent more time with student interaction, they were more likely to do community service, and this is all self-reported, but it does show that they, in their minds, they're seeing this as having some kind of motivation to do more other-oriented activity. The spiritual atheist category is perhaps the most fascinating to me, that 22% of atheists, or about 1/5 of atheist scientists, consider themselves to be very spiritual people. There are not enough atheists in the U.S. general public to really be able to compare these two populations, but I found this quite surprising. Tom, a biologist I call Tom, who sees himself who's an atheist, but also sees himself as a very spiritual person, so that people who have spirituality believe in God and they think of it that way. Personally, I believe in nature, and I get my spirituality from being in nature, but I don't really believe there's a God. And he is sort of implicitly in this passage and also elsewhere in the interview compares himself to the spirituality of the general public, which he thinks is very much linked to a kind of theism which he does not have. I want to share with you just a little bit of the work that we have done, I and collaborators have done on what we're calling the ROSIC study, the Religion Among Scientists in International Context. Right now we're working on a pilot study which we'll use to develop survey themes for the research. And we're meeting in late August to do textual analysis of we'll have completed about 70 interviews at that point among these nations. Right now we've done 55 pilot interviews. We've done the most in the UK at this point. We've also, I took a recent trip to Turkey and did 7 interviews with scientists there. We've also done interviews with Indian scientists, and then we're just beginning to do interviews with scientists from the other nations that I mentioned. I want to talk, in part because I'm in the UK, but also because we have the most interviews with that particular population at Cambridge and Oxford. Catherine Sorrell, who's a graduate student who's worked with me, who's here with me today. And I have interviewed quite a few people at Oxford and Cambridge and now at Imperial College London. And one thing that's really striking is the pervasiveness, of course, of the Church of England, the difference in that kind of religious context when compared to the U.S. Religious context, of course, where there's no official state church, and the kind of impact that has on scientists. And I want to read a quote from my biologist who said, you grow up in a society, and obviously that shapes your viewpoint to a certain extent. In this country, the UK has an established religion, and I'm old enough that when I was in school, every day had to start with an act of Christian worship, and growing up, I love this phrase, it's just understood that that's the setup. So if I had to very succinctly describe, the difference between U.S. and U.K. scientists with as little data as I do, I would say that U.K. scientists, elite research universities, have a better understanding of the God that they're rejecting to some extent. And there's so much more knowledge about religion, particularly among the older scientists, than there is among older U.S. scientists. And I'm eager to kind of follow up that theme and see if I'm really right about that, but that's kind of an initial hypothesis. That may bring a good deal more cynicism among UK scientists. We're not exactly sure yet, but that seems to be coming out they just have much more and much deeper theological explanations of why they are not religious than did U.S. scientists. And there's also a kind of flexibility that they say. This biologist said to me that the Church of England is a wonderfully flexible religion. You can bend any way you like. Catherine and I interviewed a scientist today. I'm forgetting, do you remember, Catherine, the word that he used? It's a very gracious religion. Oh yes, a very giving religion. So, and we asked him to follow up on that. It was very similar to what this fellow said, that this is a religion that is not very offensive. It's very flexible, so it's not a problem for science. There's also the perception, though, of a secular society. Another biologist said, so in the midst of that official state religion, the perception of a secular society, a biologist said to us that, Britain is actually a fairly secular society. I don't see a connection with religion. It doesn't influence policy or philosophy or certainly science in a way that I could see that it has done in the United States. I think they're just completely separate, and far fewer U.S. scientists would say something like that. There's also a sense that one has the possibility of belonging without believing. There was also, in the very few interviews we've done so far here, there's also the sense that one can partake of the church without actually believing, and that's just fine to do. Among U.S. scientists, I did not find that. As I said before, there was a much more pervasive sense of taking a stand against any kind of organized religion, whereas even the most atheist scientists of these 32 that we've interviewed here, said, 2 or 3 I can remember, were very, say, yes, I'm totally an atheist, I don't believe in anything that the church stands for, but I love the music, I go, I'm a part of it, it's an important piece of my culture, and that could have a significant impact on how they think about religion, and this biologist is indicative of that. So I enjoy going to church for the suspension of disbelief, for the theatrical experience, for reading, for the liturgy, for the magnificent stories. I love this quote. But what I don't get, what I found myself just unable to reach, is the kind of communion with the deity. I tried very hard, but I found I couldn't share it. There's also, unlike U.S. scientists that I've worked with, where spirituality can seem a kind of scientifically acceptable alternative, it's sort of something that can be created that's very consistent with science. There's in the UK scientists, among the UK scientists so far, a kind of suspicion of spirituality, an idea that spirituality is not really a legitimate path, that it's sort of oddly inconsistent with science, is perhaps even worse than religion in some ways in terms of its inconsistency. A biologist said to me that the term spiritual is used a lot more now in general because we want to acknowledge there's more to life, but somehow they don't know what it is. But I'm not sure that I believe it's real outside the established church. So there's kind of a suspicion of this sort of spirituality without church. There's also a corresponding fear of fundamentalism. The kind of fear that U.S. scientists have of evangelical Protestants is shared here among Muslims. I first got the idea of doing an international study on this topic when I was in the UK for work, and I had a conversation with a scientist and sort of told him about the work that I had done among U.S. scientists, and he said, yes, you have such a problem with evangelical Christians and science in the U.S. He said, your evangelicals there are our Muslims here. They're a problem for science. And I thought, oh, that's very nice to call a whole religious group a problem. That's very much sophistication in thinking. But it does show that there are very different national contexts, and that it's a mistake to assume that thoughts that the scientific community has about religion are necessarily consistent, that science is completely transnational in that way. That national contexts probably do matter a great deal, although we're not entirely sure exactly how they matter. So there is worry about Muslims, and I want to share another quote with a biologist. We've done the most interviews with biologists so far, who said, I love this. He had a Saudi Arabian student once, and the student was a very devout Muslim. Said, but I couldn't get him to repeat experiments. If the experiment didn't work the first time, well, then Allah directed him in a different direction. He didn't ever repeat something that didn't work, because that was not exactly blasphemy, but it was being arrogant. It was going against the will of God. Now, in some ways, it's a funny quote, and again, as in the Catholic example, I don't in any way want to be disrespectful. This scientist was not at all disrespectful. He was really struggling with how he would respond to this student. and wanted very much to see the students succeed, but was also fearful, rather than discussing the sort of religious motivations and finding different views on repetition of experimentation in the Muslim community, as I'm sure that there are, there was just sort of a fear, a sort of paralyzing response in this case. This was also very different when I noticed in terms of the response that scientists in the US had to evangelical Christians. US scientists never think for a moment that there are actually evangelical Christians in the scientific community. So they don't have any fear of evangelical graduate students thinking certain things that they have to deal with. And there's a kind of difference here, which we need to, again, this is me hypothesizing, we need to find out if this is more true as we go deeper into these data and collect more data. But there seems to be here the sense that Muslims are actually more endemic to the scientific community, that they are pervading the scientific community more, actually getting degrees, whereas there's not that kind of, it's more the fear from outside of evangelical Protestants in the US. There are also, among these these small number of UK interviews, there is a sense that religion can be used for ethical principles as a way to guide science, and not really very much of a fear of that there's an appreciation for the kind of moral commitments that religion can give someone, even if one does not attend or does not actually believe in the other kinds of religious beliefs that for some go along with those moral commitments. Another biologist said that I'm aware that religion provides a strict code of conduct for what is right and what is wrong, and that's a good thing, but I don't buy the God thing and all of that. He said that in response to a question that I asked him about the possibility that religion could have an impact on science ethics. I do want to talk a little bit about how the research that I've done in the US and the small bit of research that we've done now in other national contexts does start to dispel some of the myths that people have about the connection between religion and science, and what in particular scientists think about these issues. One, in the US context, certainly not all religion is conservative Christianity. At least 70% of the US population does not identify as evangelical. In the UK context, Muslims are certainly entering the sciences. Also, the scientific community does not seem to yet have an awareness that even conservative Christianity is diverse in its approach to science, and may be more accepting of science in some ways than they think. Also, there's the possibility of religious scientists in the science community, which research like this shows, and that those religious scientists have the possibility, as a part of their scientific outreach, to help religious people, members of religious communities, to understand science better, to engage with science and the reality of science more effectively. There's also a message for religious communities. There is the very strong, I think, myth, especially among some evangelical Christian communities in the US and perhaps other communities, that atheist scientists are very hostile to religion always. And I can find, only in the data that I collected among these US universities, only on perhaps one hand the number of scientists who are atheists who are extremely hostile to religion and who are making sort of business out of being very negative towards religious communities. And sometimes people ask me, what this research says about the effectiveness of the new atheists in the US. And I say, well, it's really not a movement, but more a collection of individuals who are writing very prolifically. Most scientists at elite research universities are too busy to be involved in, these extreme forms of new atheism. And I want to say very strongly that what research like mine uncovers is that there is a kind of diversity in atheism, that just as there's religious diversity, that there are diverse reasons that scientists are atheists, and diverse motivations and diverse ways that that plays out for them. So religious communities should understand that better. Also, there is the myth that science is always the cause of unbelief. Social science research has a very hard time showing causality, and I think it's much truer to say there's more or less evidence for or against something. at least in their own terms, scientists do not even see their scientific knowledge as being related to their unbelief in most cases, that it's usually for other kinds of reasons. One very powerful reason they give is that they do not have conversation partners that help them with tough questions when they were children. They usually say that they decided not to be religious at a very young age, well before they had formal scientific training. So if there is a transition from belief to unbelief, it's taking place at a much earlier time in their particular minds, well before they actually enter science. And there is the possibility that scientists are, of course, religious, although many of them are not, at least at these kinds of elite research universities, and they have different forms of religion, at least in the U.S. population, and probably in the UK as well, although that needs to be studied more extensively. I think there is a message. I want to bring up this quote that Evelyn, the biologist I interviewed, gave. That she said, "When I asked hard questions, I was told just to make a decision to believe. My experiences with religion was that it was a way that judgment was passed on people who are different." Now, social science research, is essentially descriptive and cannot indicate for you, how to live your life. But these, I think this kind of data, if one is concerned about religious communities being more thoughtful or retaining their youth, that's a very instructive quote, that religious communities ought to think more about how they mentor youth, what kind of impressions they display of science from the pulpits, how they think about adult education and training parents of youth to talk about these kinds of issues. That's very instructive for youth ministers and other pastoral leaders, that this kind of thing is a product of an experience in an evangelical Protestant community. There's also the possibility for those who want to see more of a connection between science and faith within religious communities, of seeing scientific work itself as a kind of vocational calling, not having just religion and particularly what we think of as traditionally ministerial pursuits as a calling, but thinking of science itself as a kind of calling and mentoring scientists within religious communities as to how they might reach out to broader publics as part of their scientific outreach, but also how they might reach out to youth within their religious communities. And seeing religious scientists as I'd mentioned, ambassadors to the broader public. Would there be a space within the scientific community to see religious communities, to see outreach to religious communities as a kind of scientific outreach work that is legitimate? Now, that is a far cry from what's happening, but that would be a kind of interpretation that one could have of these research if you want to see a more effective synergistic relationship between religion and science. Then the place to start may be to have scientists themselves who are religious take the leadership in doing outreach to religious communities. I think I'll stop there. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
We do? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that. Good. Over to you, Bill.
One thing I'm just wondering, something that I'm missing here is agnostics. Where are the agnostics? Are those the spiritual people? Are there agnostics in the atheist group? Are there agnostics in the religious group? And why did you avoid that term in your research?
There are, because it's too difficult to talk about in this kind of context, but I'm glad you asked. I spend quite a bit of time in my book talking about that category. And it's very hard for people to believe this, because in the general population, depending on which surveys you believe and how things are conceptualized, somewhere between 6 and 8% of the U.S. public would be atheists and agnostics lumped together. The extreme difference in agnosticism in the scientific community cannot be overestimated. So there are people who think of themselves as religious, who attend religious services very regularly, who even think of themselves as evangelical Christians and are comfortable with that label. Not a lot, but a few in this population who also see themselves as agnostic, because scientists are not going to say that for sure they believe in anything. So, but you could have a range from, I am 98% sure that God exists and 2% concerned that he doesn't, to the flip, right? So they actually, the agnostic category is across all of the three categories that I mentioned, and it's not really accurate to these data to parse it as its own separate category because it's reflected in each of the other categories. It's very hard to explain on a slide, but that's really most accurate to these data.
Good, thank you. Yes.
Elaine, thank you very much for your talk. And this is the second time that I hear in this everything. Every time I think about different aspects, I just wonder. I'm curious about the long-term results of the 5 of the countries that you are choosing and the different backgrounds. But I wonder, why didn't you choose any South American country that it's we know that Christianity it's expressed differently in usually the relationship of science and religion in South American countries tend to be also conflicted. Most universities, they are really secular, so there are two groups. So what are the criteria that you didn't choose? I just wonder, just curiosity.
No, thank you very much. So axes of comparison, there are about 8, and I'll mention just a few of them. Science infrastructure development. So we wanted a mix of countries that are both developed science infrastructure. I mean, to even do research on this topic in country, we needed to have a large population of scientists, but I wanted both countries which are developed, like the UK, and developing in science infrastructure. We wanted countries that had a mix of religion and lack of religion in the general populace. We wanted countries which were in different regions of the world, and there were quite a few other comparisons. Then beyond that, there were practical reasons of available collaborators, interest in this topic, funding source. This project has about 3 different funding sources now. And so there were other kinds of practical reasons. I considered very strongly adding Brazil to the study because it was a very good country for several of these axes of comparison and may still do that. We've recently added India. At this point, practically, the project is getting too large. So I'm not sure that we would add another country, but I think you raise a good point. My answer is not particularly excellent, but to say that there are very good reasons for choosing these countries, but there would be good reasons for adding others as well.
Like you point out, it's not just South America you're ignoring, it's the entire Southern Hemisphere.
That's right. That's in part. There's not a really good way to study Africa, for example, in this study for some very practical reasons.
Yes. Yes.
Can you give us some figures to compare the rate of religiousness between scientists and public society? Any comparison, meaningful differences between these two?
Mm-hmm. So I gave that for the U.S. I do not yet have that data for the other countries. I should say to your colleague who asked the question about other countries, another practical reason that we chose the particular countries we did for the international study is because those countries also have reliable surveys of the general population and the religiosity of the general population. And so for reasons of expense and practicality, I did not want to try to also develop an in-nation survey of the populace alongside this larger survey, but also wanted to be able to compare those things to some extent. So things like the World Values Survey, the International Social Science and Political Science Survey, those those reliable survey data were available in these other countries, and they're not, for example, in Africa and other countries. But we will be able to look along some basic indicators to be able to compare the scientific community in these nations to some religious measures in the general public whose available survey data to be able to provide that.
Thank you. Yes.
Just a clarification of the terms in the study that you did on U.S. university scientists. You said 30% were secularists, and you mentioned that them not going to church even for a wedding or a funeral. Would those be outliers, or is that a characteristic of that whole 30%?
That is a characteristic of that 30%. There are there are some in the scientific community. I wouldn't want to confuse this with being on a crusade against religion. It's more that they are choosing for themselves not to partake of religion. I think just because of their lack of participation doesn't mean they're necessarily against all religion, but they've made a real commitment.
It's rather extraordinary though. If they have a nephew or a niece or something married and they don't go to the wedding, or is that what they say?
So your religious category is capturing a lot of people. Like, if they don't attend regularly, but they would go to a wedding, they get dropped into the religious category?
More than twice. So it's not that every single person in that 30% of secular would say that they've never been into a church or religious service. But that's the kind of, so I want to distinguish strongly between survey research and interview-based research. So that's the kind of narrative they would have, in an interview, that I'm very committed. I, even think twice about stepping inside a church for, a symbolic service. I just don't want to be affiliated with religion at all. And in terms of religious category, I did include in the religious category people who interfaced with religion regularly. So people who attended, semi-regularly in sociologic terms is, at least every 2 months. Have 6. I think we coded it as 6 to 8 times a year, which is not deeply attending, having religious beliefs, identifying as being part of a religious group, and some kind of regular attendance, but then there's a range on attendance levels.
It's very interesting because I don't know if you're familiar with, well, you mentioned Larson, but all the research in health and religion is approached in quite a different way, in the sense that they make quite a distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic religion. So they even make a distinction between someone who would be a regular attender but would say that their religion doesn't necessarily invade all aspects of their life. So they could even be going to church every Sunday, but if they don't say that it affects all aspects of their life, they would still be considered having extrinsic religion.
So there, and in the health research, it's my understanding, at least of the research that's done in sociology, and I think there's other kinds of research done in psychology and other social science field, that one of the main factors that they're looking at is social support. And that was also something I looked at in the study. We'll discuss it here. But in my book and articles on this particular study, I talk about ranges of religious participation and ranges of meanings for engaging in religion and benefits and things like that. Not to the extent, I'm not interested in this study in health benefits, and so the ways of conceptualizing religion are a bit different than those studies that you mentioned.
Thank you. Yes.
I study statistics, and I was just wondering, this is very, as a minister of church, I am very emboldened and encouraged that 50% reported themselves as religious. But I noticed that the non-response is 25%, meaning 1 out of 4 did not respond to the survey. Is it possible that those who did not choose to respond in the survey have actually opted out of the studies because they are essentially, say, not open to surveys like that? Meaning, could the data be skewed by the fact that a significant proportion has decided not to go with the study because they might be not religious at all?
So survey research is inherently imperfect. A 75% response rate is extremely high. It's about the highest that you would ever see on a survey. So it's so I also did I did on those 25% what we call non-respondent analyses with available data. We did some calling of people who didn't respond to try to see if we could understand the reasons that they didn't respond. I also had the luxury, the scientific community is a very vocal community and feels very empowered in the U.S. at these types of research universities. I had 300 people write me emails about why they didn't like the study or why they didn't respond, and I also analyzed those data and wrote an article about that. So I'm very concerned about issues of non-response, as you can see. And I could talk to you all day about it. I think it's a huge deal in social science research, and really disagree with recent articles that have argued that non-response is not that big of a deal. The people who didn't respond, we're not demographically, so I can tell you if we're not demographically different than other people, and seem to be in their reasons pretty evenly mixed between people who were religious and not religious. My sense is that they were probably more likely to be extreme in their views, so that could have affected the results to some extent, but that they seem to balance each other out. That I got, there's more extreme non-religious people than extreme religious people in the scientific community, but I seem to get about a mix of reasons for non-response, which made me feel pretty good.
Okay. Yes. Yep.
I think I'm probably trying to think too much like a biologist, but the way biologists do experiments, we would never get past review if our control group didn't do exactly what our experimental group, except for one variable. And I know it would be totally ridiculous to have you do just as big of a survey of the general population compared to the elite scientists, because that would double your work basically. But can you talk a little bit about how you ensure that the surveys you use to compare the general population to your survey are, how you make sure that they're comparable, and do you word your questions in a very similar way? And
so the way that we think about it, so the kind of ways that we think about experimentation for biology are not possible with human subjects, so that's one kind of clarification. Secondly, the way that we think about utilizing control groups is, as you wisely stated, is that we actually ask the same questions that are asked in general population surveys. So any good social science survey on a specific population will then basically replicate, endemic to the study, will replicate other surveys on broader populations, which is what I did. So the way that I was able to give you those comparison statistics of the general population, which I do on many, many other kinds of indicators, not just religious identity, was through replicating a well-known U.S. general population survey. So that's how we think about that.
Thank you. Yes.
Is there any comparable information for the humanities? Are the evangelicals not doing science but going into the arts, or are they just not going to university? Or?
Well, I started out this study actually, its comparative axis was natural and social scientists. So there is, I didn't share with you about that work today, but there is a research literature which argues that there are fewer religious people in the social sciences than in the natural sciences, and the theoretical line of thinking is that that's because the social sciences are heavily politicized in the way that the natural scientists are not, and that religious people are perhaps more conservative politically in the U.S. and just don't go into the social sciences, whereas the natural sciences are not as politicized. I think that argument falls apart to some extent when you compare internationally. The Christian landscape, even among traditional Christians in the UK, is very different in terms of its political leaning than the US and that kind of thing. So that's one kind of thing I can say. I was not able to get funding to study the humanities, but it's my understanding from much older research that's been done among, say, humanities graduate students, comparing them to natural science graduate students. Rodney Stark, sociologist at Yale University, did some of this work in the early 1960s and throughout the 60s, argued that humanities students and social science students tend to be much less religious than natural scientists. I did not find a discipline-specific difference. And I think that that's in part because the social sciences, by which I mean psychology, sociology, political science, and economics, really are starting to mirror the methodologies and outlook and demographics of the natural sciences at the kinds of research universities I studied. I think if I were to study small liberal arts schools, other kinds of regional universities, and especially, say, religiously informed colleges, that the results of this study would be perhaps quite different.
Thank you. Dennis has a question.
Yes, I just wanted to come back to your very low percentage of Protestants or evangelical Protestants of 2%. So I guess it would be interesting to hear what some of the people who are on faculties of different universities here think. But I guess the most obvious explanation is the self-selection, isn't it? That, you know, therefore, those people don't go to those secular universities. They tend to go to the Christian liberal arts colleges or Christian schools or Biola or somewhere like that. So that self-selection is going to start very early. It'll just carry on right through. So they'll be much more likely, if they go as a student to Calvin College, they'll more likely end up on faculty and those sort of places. So do you want to comment on that, and can we get some comments from maybe some of the other faculty here from the States? That would be interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one would need to do a very large study over time to be able to get more conclusive evidence on that. My sense is that there's self-selection at several different levels. That probably there is self-selection at the level of career choice very early on, and majors. There's been some interest. There's been a study called the Higher Education Research Initiative. Harry, at UCLA, a colleague of mine who's actually a postdoctoral fellow with me now, Christopher Scheidel, just wrote an article in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, where he argued that Christian students across all university types, both secular and Christian colleges, tend to favor very strongly majors that are more humanistically based. And by that I do not mean they become English PhDs. By that I mean they become social workers. They are majors that they feel help the world, and they're not natural science majors in large numbers. And the reasons that they gave in this survey data is very, very large. The Harry Project is enormous. Were reasons of these professions. It wasn't clear, with the exception of medicine, where they're much larger. I've done some survey work of physicians in the U.S. a much larger proportion of religious people, even in elite medical schools, even teaching in elite medical schools in the U.S. But then I think Dennis raises a really good point. There's also, even perhaps after they do go into the sciences, self-selection into particular types of universities, and that could be for different reasons. I've also done some work on gender, family life, and science. Research university professors work on average between 60 and 70 hours a week, and religious. It's not that people at religious colleges don't work hard. That's certainly not the case. It's that those kinds of college atmospheres would tend to support family life more or value family life. So that may be one kind of reason. To not, there's the sense that giving oneself entirely over to science is what it takes to work at a research university. So there, persons, especially conservative Protestants, perhaps have different kinds of values that would lend them into different directions as well. So I have probably 10 working hypotheses, but I wish someone would pick up that question.
Yeah, any comments from American faculty members about that?
And Bill's a Stanford,
Yep.
right?
State University, University of Arizona.
Uh-huh.
And I would say that the evangelicals are few and far between. And it's the 2% wouldn't surprise me.
Even at Arizona State as well.
Even at Arizona, yes. But I had
The home of Lawrence Krauss and
yes,
yes,
yes, there are. Yes, but I have an observation and a question.
Yes.
The observation is that there is some concern in the academy about evangelicals coming through the system and doing just what it takes to get the PhD, and then using that cachet of wherever you come from to be able to then go to a Creation Science Institute. I'm a geologist, and there have been numerous examples of evangelicals coming through and then immediately after having done a bona fide PhD on that would indicate your result, turn around and move to a creation science environment and use the cachet of their PhD to do that. So there is some concern in the States about evangelicals, not so much at the undergraduate level somehow ruling the system, but coming through the graduate programs.
Yes.
and doing that. So that's just an observation. When you said U.S. was different than the U.K. in that system, I haven't seen that difference, at least at the environment that I've been in.
And I don't know, how that would work itself out in the UK. I do think, another factor that I did not mention in response to Dennis's question, of course, is the open issue of whether or not discrimination against certain religious forms exists in the academy. Again, I can only report what people tell me with this kind of social science research, and that did come up as a theme among both evangelical Protestants and very committed Catholics, that they sometimes felt kept out of certain kind of conversations or scientific meetings, particularly in issues related, one Catholic said to me, particularly in issues, if she was a biologist, related to science ethics, and people were concerned, that she might not support embryonic stem cell research, and kind of question her ability to mentor students. And so there's, those kind of like suspicions, because there's such polarization and tension between the scientific community and the general public. There is a sense of like, oh, are you one of them or one of us? That's the perception among religious scientists, as I said, just Catholics and evangelicals. It didn't come up with any of the other religious groups.
This actually gets at the question. I said an observation and a question. The question I have is that I didn't know you before your presentation, and I don't have any sense of your religious affiliation at the end of this presentation.
Yes.
And is that intentional? And is that important for the peer review of your work, or the acceptance of your work in the academy, to make sure that no one would know it, whatever it is, and as a motivating factor? I guess that's I'm curious.
No, I'm part of a Christian community, and that's pretty evident if you look, me up on the web and the kinds of things that I've done and the kinds of talks that I give. I wouldn't say that this study would be was particularly motivated by my own background, or as much as we can ever tell if these things are motivated. I'm not a natural scientist. I didn't care a ton really about this issue before I got involved in it. I was more struck with if you're asking more about my own motivation for doing this research, I was more struck by the kind of like extreme media polarization around this issue, especially in 2005 when we saw the creation, the school board discussions about intelligent design, the kind of media coverage of those discussions, as well as the kind of discussions within the scientific community in places like my own research university and other universities that I've been a part of, and wondering if research could tell us, good, well done research could tell us things that would help contribute some actual data to that conversation, rather than just myths, what I come to see as myths being just sort of lobbed by one group towards another.
Great. Yes?
No, I've been doing some research on evolution and biology and going to blogs and websites. And there's a website called Why Evolution is True. Mm-hmm. And it's extraordinary, the religious fervor of these biologists that evolution is true, and anybody who raises any kind of query or wants any kind of richer understanding of it is a bit of an idiot.
Well, I think there is an extreme reaction, at least when over the 4 years that I did my study of U.S. national political scientists, there was an extreme reaction in the scientific community, especially around the issue of evolution. So even when, for example, I was interviewing a particle physicist who did no work in evolution, they wanted to talk to me all about how they were an evolutionist, how they were so angry about religious groups So we call this, people when there's push, there's a whole literature in social science on boundaries and how people erect boundaries around ideas and around groups of people and keep some people in and some people out. There's a whole research literature about that. It's a very well-established principle that when you feel reaction against, then your boundary becomes very stiff. So there's going to be no more conversation. We are all, although I'm not a biologist, I'm very convinced of evolution myself from, what my own schooling and what I know. But what I was struck by was the lack of any kind of conversation, or, certainly that's not the way to make friends and influence people, to say, we will never discuss this, you are all stupid, right? That's not the way to kind of win a hearing and have a conversation. And so that's perhaps a kind of science outreach principle that I think some very well-intentioned people have started to write about. There's journals that discuss science outreach, and I've published in some of those. I've published some work on science outreach more recently on this topic, but also related to my work on gender. And I think some scientists are really starting to come around to recognize the importance of being in dialogue with the religious public, and to kind of start to think more creatively about what that might mean.
But it isn't just that between religion and science. It's also like, there was a book published a couple of years ago called What Darwin Got Wrong, and the philosophers published it, said they were atheists, and they pinned their atheistic colours very clearly to the mast. But they gave quite interesting, made quite interesting challenges to evolution and the way the kind of just so story, you know, polar bears, you know, but they just, they really made a very cogent challenge to it, but in impenetrable philosophical terminology. But they were, it was actually described as a career smashing move to publish this book, challenging evolution, challenging the mechanisms of evolution. But it kind of is a religion, really.
Dennis has a...
Can I make a very quick comment, because we want to get in it?
Yeah.
I'm just going to point out that Ed Larson is here tomorrow.
Right.
And
Oh,
will speak.
wonderful.
Indeed he is.
So if anyone has any questions about his survey, although he's not going to be speaking about it, it's something other topic.
Yeah, and he's, I draw on his work a lot, and of course, he's a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and
Yes,
you know,
indeed.
many other things to commend his work to, but this whole discussion and present-day social science is, of course, influenced by good historical work. So.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think we should give you a big round of applause.